Good morning, my name is Jacob Cole. I am a junior at Luther College, and my research is titled No Homo Bro, Sexuality and its Perception in the High School Environment. Sexuality and the LGBTQ+ community have garnered significant attention in recent years. Events such as the 2015 Supreme Court ruling on marriage equality and the massacre at Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, less than 1 year later, have raised questions and concerns across the nation about LGBTQ+ rights. Within the field of education, these questions are focused on how educators and society can better provide for LGBTQ+ students. This study looks at perception of sexuality in the high school environment and considers both how this perception affects students in the community and also what teachers can do to make their classrooms a more accepting environment. Interviews were conducted with 14 students from various colleges, asking them to reflect on their high school experience and how sexuality and its perception played into that experience. These students were selected through snowball sampling with the goal of interviewing students of various sexualities, backgrounds, and upbringings. The analysis and presentation of this research is built on common themes found in the interviews and in research and uses frameworks of queer theory to help shape the research and its takeaways. Queer theory is characterized by varying methods of questioning desire and its relationship to identity. Who do I desire? How do I desire them? And how can I place that desire within my identity? To be queer is to defy the norm, and in a way, this research presentation is queer as it defies the norms for a standard presentation. I'll be presenting my interview findings in a spoken word format, and I'll read the question followed up by direct responses from the interviews. Did the perception of your sexuality by others affect you, your education, or your educational experience? And if so, how? You were expelled if you were anything but straight. I went to a religious middle school and had to stand up and say, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. My mother told me that bisexuality isn't real, it's just an excuse to sleep around. It made me feel terrible and deny who I was for a long time. I went to a Christian high school, and the topic of any sexuality other than straight was very taboo. Being anything besides heterosexual was not even thought of as a reality. I didn't come out until senior year, so I only had experiences of being in the closet. It was a game of checking yourself to make sure you're not being too gay. I knew people would talk about it, but I wanted to show people that I'm not defined by my sexuality. Have you ever felt the need to play into the role of a sexuality or an identity other than that with which you identify in order to fit in while at school? Absolutely. Definitely. Being bisexual, it's very easy to appear heterosexual. I felt the need to play into being straight because that's what everyone else expected. 100% yes. The entire time I was in high school, I tried to be perceived as straight. I had to adapt to people's expectations of me. Did the idea of coming out of the closet affect your perception of sexuality in general or your perception of yourself? The idea of coming out scared me and still scares me. I never wanted to make that statement. I felt like I had to come out, but I feel like people shouldn't have to. When I came out as bi, all my friends heard was, oh no, he wants to have sex with me. So I played the part of straight until college. It's something you go through being gay. People naturally assume that everyone's straight. It was very empowering, but at its core, it's still an oppressive act because it makes heterosexuality the norm, and it automatically makes you an other. Before I came out, it was on my mind all the time, but coming out changed my perspective and taught me self-acceptance. Did general statements or opinions about sexuality affect you, your education, or your educational experience? And if so, how? It was very much pray the gay away, and gays go to hell. I was looked at as a fetish. I didn't view myself as a person. I viewed myself as a piece of meat. My sexuality was changed into something for cis male consumption, and even now, it's hard to accept who I am. It made me not want to come out. The times when it was brought up was by a teacher who would make blanket statements about it being wrong. It was not talked about unless it was negative. It was very hushed and very taboo. I knew I was going to a school that wouldn't accept me. Most teachers were fairly progressive. I had a teacher who was very openly against anything LGBT. Did the culture of your hometown or the region where you grew up affect your understanding of yourself or your sexuality? I repressed my sexuality for a long time. I felt like a square peg trying to fit into a circle hole. My hometown played a huge role in helping me accept myself. It played a large role in hiding my sexuality. I couldn't be myself. Whatever you grow up with is what you think of as normal, and what I thought the US should look like isn't what the US looks like. The larger cities are more progressive than the rest of the state, but it's still not great. Straight was normal, but everything else was wrong. It's accepting, but it's not. It was suburban, but still a small town, which made it hard to identify with the LGBTQ+ community. What was the culture surrounding sexuality like at your high school? And how did that culture impact the school environment and the culture of the school as a whole? Sexuality in general, even just being sexual, was frowned upon. It was really positive. There were no bullying problems. It was very conservative and very closed-minded. Other sexualities weren't really talked about. The only times I heard the words gay and lesbian was in a mean, joking manner. They asked people to leave the school because it didn't align with their moral standards. There were programs to make students with different sexualities comfortable, but there was still immaturity present with the students. It was mostly swept under the rug. People didn't really talk about it. Straight is normal. End of discussion. Can you describe a time when you felt comfortable or uncomfortable in your sexuality in the classroom or the educational environment? I don't think I ever felt comfortable expressing my sexuality in high school at all. There was absolutely no moment when I was comfortable in my sexuality. I was mostly uncomfortable walking through school, wondering what they're thinking about me. In English class, someone expressed an anti-LGBT thought, and there was an immediate reaction from people in support of the community. It was never discussed in a classroom setting. It was always worked around and generalized. No one had a chance to be uncomfortable because it wasn't a thing. It wasn't even a subject. There was never a discussion when there should have been one. I can't think of any conversations that were had about it. Comfortable? Never. Uncomfortable? Always. I can't think of a time in high school when I was comfortable because I wasn't out. If there was one thing that would have made your high school experience better in relation to sexuality and its perception, what would that thing have been? If I had been more honest with myself, that would have helped internally. I wish teachers would have initiated discussions and raised awareness for all minorities. Signs posted on the door aren't enough to make me feel safe. A better health curriculum. To have more staff and teachers that were more supportive, and to have teachers advocating for inclusive classrooms. Having resources and support for a GSA. We need one place in the school where it's not looked down upon. What is one thing you wish people at your high school knew about you or your sexuality? Bisexuals aren't 50% gay, 50% straight. I'm 100% bisexual. Sexuality is fluid. What I said at 15 was part of me figuring myself out as a person. I'm not different. I'm the same person I was yesterday. Just because I'm bi doesn't mean I want to fuck you. We're all human beings. We deserve to be treated equally. Gay men are attracted to gay men. Don't flatter yourself. If there was one piece of advice you could give to LGBTQ+ students at your high school, what would it be? Be true to yourself. Living in fear really hurt me. I want to say don't be afraid, but if someone told me that, I wouldn't believe them. Love yourself for who you are. Don't be afraid and ashamed of your sexuality just because it doesn't fit into the little box they want you in. Come out when you're ready. It gets better. High school is not the world. If there was one thing you could tell the straight community at your high school that you wish they knew, what would it be? You can't pray the gay away. I wish they understood what we've come from and took the time to ask us about it. When someone comes out to you, they're putting an enormous amount of trust in you. Acknowledge that trust and be supportive. Be okay with being associated with people that are different than you and put yourself in someone else's shoes. Don't ask straight people to tell you about LGBTQ+ people. We're all human. The definition of queer focuses on mismatches between sex, gender, and identity. It dances around the need to conform to the seemingly mandatory heteronormative identity of society. However, LGBTQ+ students have an extra challenge of balancing their sexual identity with their identity at school. In a place where being anything but normal is bad, these identities often do not and cannot line up. This not only affects perception of sexuality, but it also affects the experience of LGBTQ+ students. Through my research, I determined that three main components that affect these students are religion and religious backgrounds, pervasive heteronormativity in schools, and the idea of coming out of the closet. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free speech thereof. So how can religion affect students in high school? Just because public high schools can't impose religion doesn't mean that religion can't play a role in the student body, especially at private schools that dictate what they teach and how they teach it. Even though the LGBTQ+ community is gaining visibility and acceptance, There are still some religious groups that feel the need to guard against this group asserting its identity against heterosexism and homophobia. While homophobia isn't solely based on religion, religion plays a large part in the homophobia that students experience. People have expressed concern that their religious freedom will be violated by inclusionary curricular changes, that discussing queer families and individuals in the classroom will bring sex into the classroom, and that implementing GSAs will offend religious traditions. This problem is only exacerbated at private schools, where other sexualities are never discussed, where being anything but straight is not a reality. This shapes how students view the LGBTQ+ community, and it implies a forced heteronormativity, where straight is the only acceptable option. This causes LGBTQ+ students to have a difficult time accepting themselves, even years after they leave this environment. So while the First Amendment prohibits the establishment of religion, as educators we need to be aware of the fact that religion still plays a role in the mindset of the student body and in how LGBTQ+ students see themselves. In society, straight and cisgendered is the assumed norm. Schools play into this norm with heterosexism, the idea that everyone is straight and should be straight. Something that goes hand in hand with heterosexism is homophobia. I mentioned that we can't blame all religion for all homophobia, and we shouldn't. From my research, I believe that the ultimate cause of homophobia lies in the fear of the other. As a dominant society, we're inherently afraid of those people that are different than us. So what does homophobia indicate? Does it merely indicate our fear of the other? Is it a reflection of cultural attitudes about sex and sexuality? Or does it indicate an anxiety about the fragility of the heterosexual norm? When people feel the need to assert their heterosexuality or use expressions of homophobia to root their straight identity, this promotes heteronormativity and the idea that you have to be straight. LGBTQ+ students feel the need to play the role of a sexuality that's not their own in order to fit in. They have to pretend to be straight because it's what everyone else expects. This causes students to repress their sexuality for years because they feel like they can't be themselves. Schools promote gender normativity and straightness while stigmatizing any form of non-heterosexual behavior, and this damages students. As teachers, we need to be aware that every student is different, and that just because they don't fit into the little box society makes for them doesn't make them irrelevant or unworthy. It just makes them human. Something unique to the LGBTQ+ community is the idea of coming out of the closet, announcing your sexuality or gender identity to individuals. Again, straight and cisgendered is the assumed norm. If you don't say anything, it's automatically assumed that you're straight. Just the idea of making this public statement terrifies LGBTQ+ students. High school is a game of fitting in. If you make this statement about sexuality, if you identify as a member of the LGBTQ+ community, you're automatically the other. It feeds into forced heteronormativity in that you're either straight, and hence normal, or you are not. However, other sexualities and identities are becoming more accepted. And while most students still feel the need to play a role of an identity that's not their own while in high school, other students are feeling more comfortable in themselves and confident enough to come out at some point and to make that public statement. We're at this tipping point between being comfortable and being uncomfortable with other sexualities. As an educator, I need to do what I can to help my students continue to feel comfortable in the classroom and in themselves, and to break away from some of the forced heteronormativity of schools. So how can I, a future educator, apply this research to my classroom? It's all fine and well to be aware of this stuff, but what can I do to make a difference for future LGBTQ+ students in my classroom? Something teachers need to be aware of is that schools are structured by heterosexism. This heterosexism and gender normativity permeate the educational environment. Teachers need to make sure that we're not becoming neutral in our advocacy for this community. Desmond Tutu said it best: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If we don't speak up for those students who feel like they don't have a voice, if we remain silent and don't talk about it, students internalize that and think that being gay is shameful and wrong, which creates a climate of repression and harassment. LGBTQ+ students are in class, worrying and wondering if people aren't going to be uncomfortable working with them, if people will accept them for who they are, if they'll be forced to leave the school once they come out of the closet. Even though homosexuality and queerness is becoming more accepted, teachers must still find ways to destabilize and deconstruct the heterosexist norms that essentialize many of our future students. We must expand the horizons both of our future students' education and of our own education. Discuss sexuality and diversity with an open mind. While entire schools might not be changed in a day or even in a semester, we can change classrooms and students. And soon, classrooms and students will turn into schools. I close with a quote from one of my interviews. There's a tendency for people to associate being gay with someone's identity. We're only different in one aspect. My sexual orientation doesn't define my whole life. Thank you.